This is Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern 14 here to talk about the Florida Gators entering the 2023 season. Blake, an interesting program. It'll be the second year under Coach Billy Napier. Of course, Dan Mullen got run off at the end of 2021. This has been a fascinating program to watch just the last 3 decades or so as Florida's taken turns dominating, being just kind of good to great, and then being kind of ordinary a few years, which is not something you expect out of Florida. And I think that, honestly, as you size up the 14 programs in the league and soon to be 16, I think the range of outcomes for Florida over the next 5 years or so is about as wide and interesting as any team in the league. We could probably do a whole podcast about that, but I'll put it this way, okay? I know Florida fans were not happy with 6 and 7 a year ago. They were not happy with Dan Mullen's recruiting when they got rid of him, and I think there was just cause in both cases. But the bar for success has been set so high, and you're also in a recruiting fertile ground backyard, so to speak. That's horrible phrasing, but I think you know what I mean. I'm just very interested to see where this goes because I remember talking to someone I know, one of these guys who plays golf with people connected all over the SEC, and he said, look out, Florida's the program that everybody in backroom conversations is worried about being the next big thing. And then the Gators kind of face planted down the stretch. Of course, lost Anthony Richardson to the NFL draft. Blake, I'm sorry, that's a long preamble into Florida, but I don't know how you discuss the Gators without that backdrop of expectations, without the weirdness to the Billy Napier start, and about the thought that in spite of everything, this could be one of the SEC's next great programs for the next few years.
Yeah, it could be, but I don't, we don't have a lot to go on the past couple of years, and so I think it's yes, the expectations haven't changed for Florida. I think that's fair to say. I don't think Florida all of a sudden is like, hey, we just want to try to be behind Georgia and Tennessee and maybe Kentucky and other teams that we know. South Carolina is a program that seems to be heading in the right direction. So we're just looking at teams in the East. I don't think Florida fans at least are trying to play for second place anymore. They want to be back to, like you said, sort of those eras of dominance and being at the top of the SEC East and sort of being the team like Georgia is now, to where you just expect them to win the division every year. And I think that's where we feel far removed from that right now. And so, yes, Florida could take a step forward this year. I don't think they're going to take a step forward necessarily to get to that level by any means. I think it's still a multi-year process, as we discussed kind of after last season. But at the same time, looking at how the program got here, I think is important because that's going to play into where they go moving forward. And, as we'll talk about, this is a team, if we just look at this 2023 team, that there are some areas I think they're going to get better. There are some areas they're going to take a step back. And it's just, can they put that together to at least in Billy Napier's second season be able to say, all right, we're moving in the right direction? Because, it was, I think, a pretty disappointing start to his era. It wasn't a disappointing start in terms of game one, because after game one, I think we all looked at it and said, all right, here we go. But they've got to be able to, I think, build off of last season and really take a step forward this year.
Yeah, and the weird thing is I thought they were playing so well down the stretch before that trip to Nashville against Vandy in the cold that just kind of derailed everything else. But we'll see if Florida gets it back this year. And let's start on offense. Richardson goes to the Colts, I think, 4 overall. Florida has to hit the portal and get a guy because you had the Jalen Kitna thing. I don't know how much of their future he was going to be, but certainly not after that ugly off-field mess that I won't get into. You have Jack Miller, the third, who's been there a while, but just really hasn't done much. He transferred in from Ohio State. So they went out and they got Graham Mertz, who's been an interesting guy. He was like a top 60 recruit nationally when he came to Wisconsin, I think, for the 2019 season. And it's just kind of been pedestrian. He threw about as many touchdowns as interceptions combined his sophomore and junior year, which is not good in today's game, of course. And then last year, he goes 19-10 in terms of touchdowns and picks, but threw for 2,136 yards, not overwhelming. What do you make of Graham Mertz here in the fit at Florida?
Well, I mean, I think, as you know, I don't think that they were Florida fans. I'm going to point at that. I don't know how the coaching staff feels, but I don't think there were some that were not particularly thrilled with what they saw in the spring. And um, I think it is expectations though. This whole conversation I feel like is going to be predicated on expectations in a lot of areas. He's not Anthony Richardson, and he's not going to give you the same things that Anthony Richardson gave you. And I think if you go in expecting that, you're going to be, greatly disappointed because this is just a different player in terms of you're not talking about a dual threat guy that's going to make it easier in a lot of areas offensively because he can do things both with his arms and his legs. Um, you know what I mean? So I think I think you just have to look at it differently. And I think that's what's going to make this interesting. What I think 5,500 yards totally threw for at Wisconsin in those several years he was there. But yes, I mean, there are some things that I think just with efficiency that are still to be determined, especially when you get into the SEC. And as you know, and as everyone knows who watches all the previews we do, when we talk about some defenses in the SEC, there's some pretty good defenses out there. And so, not to say that there wasn't in the Big Ten, but you kind of understand that there are still, a lot of similar challenges in terms of efficiency in this league. And so, I think when you look at it from that standpoint, I mean, it's just I think different's the best word, honestly, Chris. It's going to be a different offense with him under center, but at the same time I think their offense is still going to all be about running the ball, and we'll get to those guys in a second. But I don't know exactly what to expect from Graham Mertz because I think it's just a different situation than what we saw with Anthony Richardson. And again, I think just the overall consistency is going to be important because if you do have someone under center, I mean he's the key to everything I think on this team this year. If they are going to make those strides that we talk about, it kind of starts with him because if you say, all right, let's say he's underwhelming or this offense can't get anything going in the passing game on a consistent basis, well, then what does that mean for the running back duo that probably is one of the best in the SEC? What does that mean for a new look offensive line that I think still has something to prove? And what does that mean for the defense? That probably should be better, but it really does. Like we always talk about the importance of quarterback, but I think in this particular situation, you're moving from a guy like Anthony Richardson to someone like Graham Mertz, who has a different style, is not going to give you the stuff on the ground that you got. There's a lot on his shoulders, and so it's going to be fascinating to see kind of how he handles it. So.
Yeah, this offense to me looks much more suited to run the ball. But one big dynamic, it's you get a lot of the same guys back. Florida's got two really good backs coming back in Johnson and Etienne. And both those guys were excellent a year ago. Florida ran nearly 6 yards per running play. We take sacks out of those. But a lot of that was Richardson, Blake. And you just, how do you defend a guy who's massive, he can run, he's got a cannon for an arm? I'm just really curious because I think, again, with those backs, those are two really good backs, two of the better probably 10 in the SEC.
Yeah.
And they got Cam Carroll from Tulane to add a little bit of depth. He's been a guy that's played for them some in the past. I think he's clearly, it would seem to be their third guy, and he was behind a dude last year at Tulane. You look at the left side of their line, they got Austin Barber, their left tackle back. They got Micah, I guess it's Mazkua from Baylor, who started 10, 11 games for Baylor a year ago. He's their left guard. Kingsley Aguaquan returns. He's been their center, started every game the last 2 years. So this looks to me like a run-left team, but I'm just kind of curious how taking Richardson out of that mix for a guy who ran for minus 50 a year ago in Mertz changes or doesn't change things.
Yeah, I mean, you had three guys that ran for from between 650 and 850 yards last season, and Richardson was one of those guys, right? Johnson ran for 841. I've got it pulled up here. Etienne ran for 719. Richardson 654. And so you automatically take one of those guys out of the mix, but it's also the position that he plays and how that changes how people defend you. And because he was at the quarterback position, he wasn't just, a third running back, which technically he was, but, he was at the quarterback position. It's a little bit harder, I think, schematically to figure out ways to defend that. But now, if you take that piece of well, I mean, this, Chris, like, why have so many teams moved towards, running the type of offenses that they run with guys at quarterback who can run the ball? It's because it's just harder to defend. And, I think that's just the way it works kind of in this day and age in college football. But now, nothing against pass first guys or pass only type guys, but it's a different setup. And I think that's where I would say that I think you could certainly make the argument. I probably wouldn't necessarily bat an eye on. There's probably one I'm forgetting just off the top of my head, but I think Florida's easily got one of the deepest running back groups in the conference. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Um, but it's just, how does their production, how is it impacted by just what's around them now, and how the offense is made up, versus the way it was sort of put together last year? And I think those are all fair questions now that you look at it. But yes, I mean, they're going to want to run the ball. They're going to have to run the ball, because that is one of their strengths of this team. I don't think there's any question about it. You can pick their top three strengths. Running the ball is going to be in there. But it's just it's a different setup than it was last year. And I am very curious to see how I mean, I'm sorry, but it all ties back to Mertz. Like, it all ties back to his level of consistency, and really just getting something going in the passing game. And they've got options in the passing game, which I'm sure we'll get into here in a second. But it's not that they don't have options in terms of their wideouts and those kind of things. But if they want to run the ball, I think it's how everything else, develops around them, which the quarterback development, like the offensive line development, all those kind of things, that is your strength. And you've got to make sure that you've got people kind of around you supporting that. Because if you take that away, if Johnson and Etienne were to take a step back or something, maybe that's just a product of not having a Richardson to worry about. And now you can focus on two guys versus three in the running game. But I still think that they are going to give them enough to at least keep them where they need to be offensively. So,
Yeah, you just kind of hit my concern with the last part of your statement. I guess my question is, who do they throw the ball to? You got Ricky Pearsall, who transferred in from Arizona State, and I think led them in receiving last year. He comes back. He went, 33 for 661 and 5 a year ago, 20 yards a catch, which is a nice average. They'll use him a little bit in the running game. And then it's a bunch of guys who were pretty decent recruits out of high school. Now, some of them are newer. Some of them have been around a bit. But you got Caleb Douglas, Andy Jean, Marcus Burke, Jaquavian Fraziers, Aiden Mizell, Eugene Wilson. All those guys got rated at least 4 stars by at least one recruiting service. None of them were 5s, but all of them were 3 and 4, depending on who you ask. And so these guys were guys that were sought out after high school, and some of these guys are just going to be coming into campus, 23 recruits and a couple of 2022. So all that to say that usually receivers in the SEC don't make their mark till their second, third, fourth years on campus. Florida's got a lot of kids that were highly regarded here, but hard to know who steps up behind Pearsall as we do this in, mid to early July.
yeah, I mean, he's the clear number one, and that's what I've got in my notes here. The phrase I've got is, boy, they've got size, but they've got a largely unproven group overall. And I think that was something Phil Steele had noted. Just kind of, if you look at this Florida roster, what immediately stands out, if you're circling some things, is how many guys they've got at sort of 6 foot or taller in their wide receiver unit. There's quite a few of them. And so, and look, a couple of those are freshmen, and you just brought up a couple of those guys. And I think we've seen this before. You don't know the name just yet, and there are probably some Florida fans that probably feel like that just based on what they've heard and watched in the spring, they may have a say, all right, we have a pretty good feeling it's going to be this guy or this guy, maybe that freshman group or some of the other guys that they've added to the mix. But I don't know exactly who that's going to be, but we've seen this before where it's going to be someone. Like there are going to be 1 or 2 of these guys that are coming in that are going to have potential breakout seasons. But you know what? I say that, Chris, and you know what I'm going to say now? Maybe, because it all comes back to the quarterback, and maybe they have breakout seasons, but they've got to be put in position to do that. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. I mean, they don't really have again, it looks like a good group overall, but I do think unproven is probably the right wording, because not to say they're not talented enough or don't have the potential, because they do, but there are some young guys in this wide receiver group. And I think, again, it's just kind of getting that experience will be important. But otherwise, having Pearsall as a number one is a good place to start, but you've got to kind of have some of that group develop around him, again, because that is going to help the quarterback develop in his new role there with Mertz. So,
okay, defensively, Blake, I think we both grew up kind of with vintage Florida, Steve Spurrier's teams, and offense always stole the show. You had Werfel and the fun and gun and all the stuff, and you had Tim Tebow. But the thing was, I think that always overshadowed how consistently good their defenses were. Felt like they were always ranked in the top 10 nationally. the last few years, and of course this was under Dan Mullen, they had Todd Grantham as a coordinator for 4 years, and they just got progressively worse against stopping the run. Grantham's last 2 years, they gave up 5.5 and 5.3 yards per run plays. Teams were running it almost half the time against them, I guess just because they could. Pass defense was okay, not great. Last year under Patrick Toney and Sean Spencer, and Toney is now gone to the Cardinals, and so they're replacing him with Austin Armstrong as a co-coordinator there with Spencer, who'd been at Penn State and Vandy before that. But last year, run defense got a little better, but still not up to SEC standards. They gave up 5 yards even per running play, 7 yards per throw. No, they did force turnovers on 2.4% of plays, which I think kept them in a lot of games and helped. But I don't know. It feels like this is a program that just it's sort of lost its way compared to what it used to be. And I think they're looking to get back there. They hit the transfer market pretty heavily, added some guys up front that I think they feel will help. But yeah, I just remember Florida, all those stud defensive linemen they had, good linebackers, first rounders in the secondary. And this has been the last couple of years a pretty good departure from what vintage Florida has been on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at the numbers, right, from last year specifically, 99th in rushing defense, 96th, I think, in yards allowed, 86th in scoring defense, 83rd in passing. So, like, those are those are not, like you said, they're not vintage Florida numbers. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you really think it back to last year, like, man, if we could just be a little bit better defensively, that probably results in a couple more wins in there somewhere. But yeah, I mean, they have to be better on the defensive side. We're not saying anything that Florida fans don't already know. And I think it's just a matter of seeing how some of these changes are going to, you talked about Armstrong coming in and maybe how that changes the style a little bit of how they approach things on defense. You talked about the new guys coming in. I know Cam Jackson, someone that I've seen the name pop up a lot on social media and just from people who are there talking about, the Memphis transfer and how he could, he should be able to be, I think, one of the top probably producers on that defense. And, I mean, they've got to get better in multiple areas. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. As I just said, I mean, I think that's what it comes down to. And I think it's just trying to figure out who are going to be the guys that push them to be better in those areas, because they have to, because like we talked about, there are some questions on offense, and maybe there were times last year where Richardson could get you out of some things and just with the rushing attack. But the defense has to be able to, help matters too on the offense. And we know that these are two units that have to work together for both to be able to get where they want to go, especially with the schedule that Florida has, which I'm sure we'll touch on at the end. But yeah, I mean, I think overall, I feel like they're going to be better up front. I think that's one of the quotes I saw too, just in kind of doing the research and seeing some of the things out there that, Billy Napier feels like their front seven is definitely going to be in a much better position. And certainly one of the strengths overall. And that's, like I said, that's where maybe seeing a Jackson take a huge step coming over from Memphis, and the depth at linebacker. I think they're bringing in multiple transfers there. And so I think that's probably the starting point on the defense, is just being able to be better in terms of stopping the run. Because like we said, the 99th in rushing defense, just being able to get more pressure on the quarterback, because we always talk about that in this league too. Think about how many offensive linemen the SEC sends to the NFL every single year. And so it's not always easy to get that pass rush, but that combination of things is what's going to have to be there for Florida, I think, if they're going to be a much improved team on the defensive side. So,
well, if you're going to run on these guys, you're going to have to push them out of the way. Listen to some of these weights up the middle. We start with Desmond Watson, who they're listing, I think, in the spring at 6'5", 449. You might want to get a little lighter than that. Jackson, you mentioned the Memphis transfer, who played 13 games there last year, had 41 total tackles, so he was productive. That's not always the way you judge a nose guy, but he's 6'6", 355. So that's what they start with at the nose. They got Jamari Lyons as the third guy. I don't know how much a factor he'll be. He's a newer guy, class of 2022. He checks in at 309. Behind him, Jalen Humphreys, 6'3", 317. So they got four guys that are all 309 plus at nose. At the tackle spot, they got Chris McClellan, who's 321, Caleb Banks, 315. They'll bring in Will Norman, who's pushing 300 already as a high schooler. They're going to be massive across the front. Now, the ends, I guess Justin Broom, kind of a still young guy. He'll be a third-year guy. Played 11 games a year ago for them and was decently productive. Excuse me, Justice Boone. At one end, and then the jack position, they've got Princey Humamalian, who's 6'5", 245, and been very productive. Probably their most known defender coming into the season, at least in terms of that front seven. I mean, Watson's kind of known for other reasons, but yeah, they do have some guys that have played before, and they're going to be plenty big there.
Yeah, I mean, they got size. There's no doubt about it. And that's why, again, probably Billy Napier knows better than we do. And just, I think to hear some of those comments about how he feels about that group on the front on the defense, I mean, that's encouraging. I think if you're, a Florida fan, you've got to feel, pretty happy about that. And like we said, they have to go forward. I mean, there's no other choice. And I do think Jackson, what was he? I think third team, I think Pro Football Focus had him as a third team All AAC guy, and he started started every game at Memphis last year, played in all the games or maybe all but one the year before. So you've got someone's got a little experience there. And I think this team overall, there's not a lot of experience, because, again, we talked about just kind of the nature of bringing in some new guys. And I think that's kind of the theme with this team is there's a lot of breakout candidates, specifically, I think, on the defensive side of the ball. But there's not a lot of experience necessarily on this team and maybe within this system. And so even though the defense only has I think 3 returning starters, that may not be a bad thing when you consider, again, kind of how they disappointed a bit last year. And so maybe just bringing in all this new talent will really help them because, again, sometimes we always talk about it's important to bring back starters, but maybe for a defense like this, kind of cleaning house and being able to bring in some new guys that fit better at certain positions, I think that's what they're banking on there. So.
Well, they do have some dudes in the secondary. That starts with Jason Marshall Jr., who I think we're going to see on some preseason All-SEC teams. I think we already are. They did some interesting things at safety last year. They got Miguel Mitchell coming back. He played all 13 games as a true freshman a year ago. So did Kamari Wilson. So their 2 starting safeties are penciled in as second-year guys. So they'll know the system better. They brought in R.J. Moten, Michigan transfer who played 14 games and was fairly productive for a really good Michigan defense a year ago. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this is the best Florida secondary we've seen, but when you start off with 3 returning starters and bring in a guy that played a lot at Michigan a year ago, that's a pretty nice starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just, again, kind of looking at a secondary that's, again, still, I think, younger, but you do bring some guys back, like you said, that have kind of been there, and that familiarity can always help. I think when you just look at it from that standpoint, and like we said, I mean, you could say the defense was worse in the rushing, game, the passing game. They were just they were not consistent in a lot of different areas, and so I think maybe just getting a little more experienced here, being able to have that opportunity. I think just to, again, to kind of have a new guy. We talked about Armstrong kind of joining in the defensive coordinator role. Maybe how you can mix and match some things with what you do in the passing game and those kind of things. So yeah, I mean, I would say sort of the same thing that I just said overall about the defense. I think it's just seeing kind of which of these guys can take that next step, and knowing that some of the guys they've got bringing in will be able to have that opportunity to do that, but also some of the returning guys maybe just building off of that experience last year, because I'm sure it's a frustrating experience. And so we'll just see how they defend the passing game, because something else too, we always talk about these teams, but you have to talk about them within the context of the league. And some pretty good quarterbacks in this league, as we know. And so I think just seeing how these passing attacks and how you defend some of these teams that, especially with the quarterbacks and wide receivers that we see throughout the SEC, Florida's got to be better in this area too, and that's kind of the common theme, I think, on defense.
Well, and we also have to talk about them within the context of the schedule, which we did on another video. So we've got that fully broken down there. But they played a brutal schedule a year ago, and Blake, I think this year's might even be tougher. That's going to be the thing that I watch. You look at teams and you say, there's some dissatisfaction going in. And then where can you find places where it could go wrong? And you got some dissatisfaction coming off 6 and 7. You got that schedule which starts with a road trip to Utah on a Thursday night. You got Tennessee in there. You got road trip to Kentucky, at South Carolina, Georgia. Arkansas at LSU. At Missouri, ending with Florida State. Again, I'm not going to go over it much further, but that's kind of the thing I'm watching is this isn't the best Florida team I've seen. It's coming off a 6-7 season, and then you got to face that.
I mean, I'm trying to look it up here. I had it in my notes, but I think you can probably argue that it's the toughest schedule in the country if you're just comparing. I mean, it's got to be top 5. If you don't want to say it's the top 1, it's got to be top 5. And the reason why is it starts with the 2 non-conference games at Utah and then Florida State. Just by Florida State now being a team that is a top 5 team, that automatically, makes your schedule tougher because there were times there we know Florida State was not that long ago. They were really struggling as a program. But knowing you got that road trip to Utah, you got to play Florida State, who most people expect to be a college football playoff front runner. And so I don't, those start there with those 2 games out of conference. But then it's like, all right, you got Tennessee, who's probably projected top 15 team. Kentucky, most people think is a top 25 team. You got to go on the road there for that one. South Carolina, we'll talk about them in our preview. We've talked about them a lot this offseason. Probably just your usual sort of wild card status for South Carolina, but we don't really think they're taking a big step back by any means. So that's a road trip that will be tough. Georgia is Georgia. They're going to be, the favorite to win the national championship for a 3rd straight season. But then you got to go to the team who's the defending SEC West champion. And again, for our money, I think both of us have LSU as our pick to win the West again this year. You got to go on the road and play LSU. And then you just got some of those who knows games, right? With Arkansas. We don't know where Arkansas is going to be. Gator Jefferson is one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Got to go to Missouri. Never an easy place to play. I mean, how many games are left besides that? 2, 3? So, I mean, it's a brutal schedule. Like I said, I think you could certainly make the argument it's the toughest schedule in college football. And so all those things we said about Florida being better, and hey, we think they're going to be better here. Their running back group is one of the best in the league. Got some playmakers coming in on the defensive side, but it's just, can that all combine to translate into wins with a schedule like this? It's going to be difficult because I think if you look right now, Chris, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, I think they're the underdog. If you had to put the betting lines out right now, I think in at least 7 games. And, I think the Arkansas one is 50-50 at Missouri. Who knows? But, I mean, if you look at all those games against the ranked teams on their schedule and at South Carolina, I think Florida's the underdog in all of those as of right now. So.
Not to mention, we'll be a favorite against a team that beat it last year in Vandy, which you tend to sort of throw that one aside and say, hey, that's an easy win.
Vandy's going to be better.
It was a year ago.
Yeah, and they're going to be better. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and maybe we'll do a top storylines video by the time we start the season. But as I'm just thinking through it, that to me is going to be one of the most fascinating storylines in the league. We mentioned that with A&M a year ago, right? We said the expectations are up here. They can kind of only get under them. You're in the SEC. You're doing it with young kids. You got a little bit of that dissatisfaction with Jimbo Fisher, feeling that they've underachieved. That was sort of a big toxic soup. And then you throw in the discord with NIL or what happened. I'm not saying it's apples to apples because it's not. Expectations for this year in Gainesville won't be maybe as high, but maybe the fact that they're not as high is probably a reflection on how people feel. Look, I think Billy Napier is a good coach. I think he was the right hire. If I'm overseeing a vacancy for a football team right now and you say, give me Billy Napier, sign me up, I'll take him. But when you start 6-7 in a place like Florida and you've got that schedule and all those things we've talked about, it's just one of those, to me, it's a recipe for a lot could go wrong, and then how do they handle it if that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, with a schedule like this, things can go south in a hurry. And I think that's the best point is those first 5 games, you've got Utah, Tennessee, and Kentucky. 2 of those are on the road. Tennessee's in Gainesville. But, man, it's not to take anything away from McNeese or Charlotte, but those are the 3 games that you look at, and I think you certainly get a very clear idea of where this Florida team is at. And not to say they won't get better, because that's what teams usually do, right? They usually get better as the season goes along. They figure out some things and you figure out how to to push the right buttons. But this is a very unforgiving schedule. And I think, like we said, to me, that's why you go back to where this conversation started, and that's at the quarterback position. And just seeing how they develop there, given this schedule and what that means for the offense, because we do. And look, I'm optimistic about the defense. I think it's going to be better. Um, but it's a lot of that's going to be dependent on how far back does the offense go? And I don't really, I'm not saying that that's my expectation is the offense is just going to fall off without Anthony Richardson, but it's just like we said, it's a different circumstance, and you're going to have a different approach than you did a season ago. And how does that impact the running backs and all that kind of stuff? But I think I'm being more optimistic, Chris, than I thought I would be with this Florida team. Just as you look at the roster and you see the different things that sort of stand out. But to me, it always comes back to you can be more optimistic, but I think it was very clear in what you see what Billy Napier did in the offseason. He understood that really trying to overhaul this roster as quickly as he could was priority number one. And I think they've tried to do that. And they've kept some of the guys in place that they need to keep in place, specifically those two running backs, Pearsall, as we said. Got some guys on defense that I think will be better a year later now than they were a season ago, but it's still an uphill climb. And I'm optimistic that they'll take that step this season, but they're going to have to do it against probably the toughest schedule in the country.
Well, and one final thing, I think culture can be a big thing. If it goes poorly and things are going poorly, it can destroy your season. I think that one thing that I like about Billy Napier is he's tried to bring a better culture. Now, Urban Meyer had an awful culture, but they were so good, and he was such a good coach, they won anyway. I don't know if it's fair to say that's one of the things that fell in on Dan Mullen or not. They did seem like you had a pretty pronounced at times Florida presence in the police blotter. And I think the bigger thing that got him was recruiting talent or not recruiting enough talent, which has started to show up. And again, that's something Billy Napier has been left with that wasn't really his fault. And so we'll see how he goes from there to put it back together. Again, I remain confident that to me he's the guy. But boy, that is not a good set of circumstances to start year two with.
Here's an interesting stat for you, and we can wrap up with this, but I don't think I realized this, but it is still interesting to think. We talk about all this stuff with Florida and them trying to get back where they want to go, but I just looked on Sports Reference here, and I found this it'd be an interesting trend. Even with all of this, they've gone 6-7 in back-to-back seasons. Still, in 8 straight years, at one point or another, they've been ranked in the top 17 in the country. Now they haven't finished there, right? Especially the past couple of seasons, but at some point or another, and we know kind of what happened last year was that win over Utah, and then kind of how that sort of catapulted them forward. But I still find that interesting. Is you can feel like Florida's far away, and the AP poll is what it is. I always say I don't put a ton of stock in these polls, but I do still think that's interesting to note as you look at this team. And I think they still, though, have only had 4 double-digit win seasons since that 13-1 year, 2009. So, yeah, I mean, that's what you're trying to get back to. You're trying to be back to the team that, I hate to say it this way, but like you're trying to get back to being the team that Georgia has become. And not everybody can do that. I think this is, we're going to see, it's kind of a rarity in college football to be able to dominate the way they have past couple seasons. But that is your measuring stick, right? Georgia is the team you're measuring yourself against. Tennessee is the team you're measuring yourself against. Look at the trajectory of those two programs right now. So it's not only that Florida feels like it's struggling the past couple of years, it's also comparing it against your two biggest rivals in the SEC. And I think that's where, for Billy Napier's, job security, you've got to, I think, make some strides this season, even though it's only year 2, because otherwise you feel like, all right, this process is getting longer and longer and longer. But as we said, it was going to be challenging when he took the job, and that hasn't really changed after one season.
Okay, I'm going to give you one last stat on the way out. And this is sort of across our ticker, across the bottom, but it's not all right there together like I'm looking at it where it really stands out. And again, I think this points the finger probably at Dan Mullen. Of course, he took over from Muschamp, who did a lot of good things on defense at times. All right, first year, 2018, they give up 20 points a game flat. Second year, 2019, 15.5. COVID year, 2020, 30.8 points a game. Mullins last year, 26.8. And I still remember that Sanford game where Sanford felt like it scored at will, which I think that was probably the last straw that got Dan Mullen out the door. And then last year, Billy Napier comes in, they give 28.9. To me, again, we started the conversation with that as a point of emphasis. But if you want it spelled out, how poorly Florida has slipped on the defensive end. Really, if you're looking for one driver of why this has not gone the way Folks and Gainesville wanted, I think, and there's multiple reasons, but I think that one is 1 or 1A or somewhere at the top of that list, Blake.
Yeah, and look, keep in mind, if you just go back to last year, right, and you're trying to improve off of that, the defense specifically, they lost, 1, 2, 3 games by a touchdown or less. But yet, in all those games, they scored 33 against Tennessee, right? They scored 24 against Vanderbilt, scored 38 against Florida State, but still lost all those games. And I think that, again, just sort of shows you. And look, that's not even, you could look at some of those games like the LSU game, right? They lost 45-35 in that one. But yeah, I mean, that's what it comes down to is you felt like at least last year they weren't that far away because they lost some close games. But if you can just, kind of know the setup now coming into the season, if the defense can be better, you're going to win some of those games. Now, that's assuming the offense can stay on track or get better. And as we said, I think that's going to be a challenge just given that Richardson's not under center. But it's still, again, I know sometimes it can feel like this team is very far away. And I'm sure if you're on the pessimistic side of things, I understand. But I don't know that they are that far away. It's just, as we know in the SEC, we say it all the time, Chris, there's just so little margin for error in this league. And when you're not able to kind of capitalize on that, as we talked about, you can go south in a hurry. And that's why I think it's so important for this Florida team. Those first 3 or 4 or 5 games, boy, you definitely want to see something, especially on the defensive side and on the offensive side. I do think they have a lot to prove there, but to really have a good idea of what this season could look like.
I'm going to go ahead and give you my way too early list of most interesting teams to preview in the SEC for 2024. I think it's Florida and Texas A&M in some order. And somebody will pop up and something will happen, and someone will slip or someone will pop up, and it probably will be more complicated than that. But it's just one of these things that you can see from the outside and just going, okay, either he's going to have a much better year than we think this year, or it's going to be something else heading into 24.
Could be.
All right, we have previewed about half the SEC so far. We got the other half to come. We'll have all that up by mid-July-ish. So hit that subscribe button. That'll notify you if you hit the notifications when we do our next previews. We do football, baseball, men's basketball, and even some women's hoops wall-to-wall here at the channel. So, again, hit that subscribe button. Tell a friend. Hit the like button. And we are Southeastern 14. He is Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. Thanks for watching. We'll be back soon with more SEC football content.